By 1540, Hampton Court Palace reeked of something far worse than rotting fish. It was the smell of King Henry VIII literally decomposing alive. What courtiers discovered in the royal bedchamber exposed a horrifying truth no one dared speak. And this stench would destroy far more than just his marriages. Imagine walking into a palace room and having to physically stop yourself from gagging. That was the daily reality for anyone entering Henry VIII's presence by 1540. Courtiers developed an unspoken technique, breathing through their mouths the moment the king approached. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their kingdoms about audiences where the air itself felt thick with corruption. This wasn't the subtle mustiness of an old building or the expected scent of unwashed bodies common in the 16th century. This was something far more sinister. The smell of rotting flesh, of infection eating away at living tissue, of wounds that wept continuously without ever healing. It clung to the tapestries hanging in the great halls. It soaked into the silk cushions of the throne. It lingered in corridors long after the king had passed through. Servants whispered about how difficult it was to remove the odor from rooms after royal visits. Even burning expensive incense and opening every window couldn't completely erase the trace of decay. The most powerful man in England carried with him the stench of death itself, and everyone at court knew it, but no one dared speak it aloud. The progression of the smell told the story of Henry's deteriorating condition better than any physician's report. In his youth, Henry had been the embodiment of Renaissance kingship, an athletic giant who hunted for hours, jousted with confidence, and dazzled courts across Europe with his vigor and charm. By the time he reached his late 40s, that image had become a cruel mockery of itself. His legs, once powerful enough to grip a warhorse for an entire day, had become columns of infected tissue wrapped in increasingly elaborate bandages. The ulcers started small, perhaps dismissed as minor injuries from his active lifestyle. But they never healed. Instead, they opened wider, burrowed deeper, and multiplied across both legs. Each wound became a source of continuous discharge, pus mixed with blood that soaked through layers of expensive fabric. The smell intensified with every passing year, evolving from unpleasant to unbearable. Those who had served Henry since his youth watched in horrified fascination as their golden king transformed into something that barely seemed human anymore. His face, bloated from pain and opium, no longer resembled the handsome prince who had once been celebrated as the most attractive monarch in Christendom. The palace itself became a monument to concealing this grotesque reality. Entire wings of Hampton Court had to be renovated with better ventilation specifically to handle the king's presence. Staff members were assigned the miserable task of constantly refreshing rooms with herbs, flowers, and burning aromatics before and after royal occupation. Yet despite these elaborate efforts, the truth seeped through every defense. Visitors to the palace noticed it immediately, that underlying current of something wrong, something rotten beneath all the perfume and incense. Some claimed they could identify which rooms the king frequented just by following their noses. Ladies of the court carried pomanders filled with cloves and ambergris, ostensibly as fashionable accessories, but in reality as desperate shields against the royal stench. Young courtiers learning the intricate dance of palace life received unofficial instruction in the art of enduring proximity to the king without showing visible discomfort. The punishment for displaying disgust could mean permanent exile from court, or worse. But what happened when that rotting flesh entered the most intimate space of all, the royal bedchamber, would reveal an even darker truth about how physical decay destroys far more than just the body. The medical reality behind Henry's condition reads like a horror story written in clinical terms. Osteomyelitis, chronic bone infection, is what modern physicians diagnose when examining the historical accounts of Henry's symptoms. This wasn't a surface wound that could be cleaned and bandaged. The infection had burrowed deep into the bone marrow itself, creating pockets of bacteria that multiplied in the warm, oxygen-poor environment inside his legs. Once established, this type of infection becomes nearly impossible to cure even with modern antibiotics. In the 16th century, it was a death sentence played out in slow motion. The infection worked like this. Bacteria would colonize the bone, causing inflammation that restricted blood flow to the area. Without adequate blood supply, tissue began to die and necrotize, turning black and producing the characteristic foul odor of rotting flesh. The body, trying to fight the infection, would create pus, a mixture of dead white blood cells, bacteria, and liquefied tissue. This pus had to go somewhere, so it would eventually break through the skin, creating an ulcer that drained continuously. The worst part? Closing these wounds only trapped the infection inside, where it would fester and build pressure until it burst open again, often larger than before. The documented accounts of Henry's leg ulcers provide stomach-turning details that historians have tried to sanitize for centuries. Court physicians kept meticulous records of the king's condition, though they coded their language carefully to avoid stating the obvious horror too plainly. They described ulcers that measured several inches across, wounds deep enough to expose underlying bone in some cases. The drainage from these wounds wasn't occasional or minimal. It was constant and copious, requiring multiple changes of dressing throughout each day. The cloths used to pack these wounds would be soaked through within hours, heavy with discharge that ranged in color from yellow-green pus to blood-streaked fluid to sometimes black necrotic material. The smell emanating from these wounds was described by one physician as most grievous and capable of causing great discomfort to those attending His Majesty. This was 16th century medical language for absolutely horrifying. The king's own body was literally liquefying from the inside out. Dead tissue was being expelled through these openings, mixed with the products of bacterial infection and the body's failed attempts to heal itself. And Henry had to live with this every single day. The constant sensation of wetness, the burning pain, the inescapable awareness that his body was betraying him in the most humiliating way possible. The pain management available in Tudor England only made the situation worse. Physicians prescribed opium preparations for Henry's suffering, and he consumed them in increasing quantities as the years progressed. These drugs offered temporary relief from the physical agony, but came with devastating side effects that compounded his problems. Opium clouded his judgment, making his already volatile temperament even more unpredictable and dangerous. It caused constipation, adding to his physical discomfort and bloating. It disrupted his sleep patterns, leading to exhaustion that his body couldn't afford while fighting chronic infection. Most crucially, the combination of constant pain, heavy opiate use, and the systemic effects of infection created hormonal disruptions that destroyed Henry's sexual function. The infection likely triggered inflammatory responses that affected blood flow throughout his body, making arousal difficult or impossible. The pain from his legs intensified with any physical exertion, including sexual activity. And the psychological impact of living with constant pain and the knowledge that his body was decomposing cannot be overstated. Yet Henry's pride would never allow him to admit that the problem originated within his own failing flesh. Instead, he would project his physical inadequacy onto the women in his life, creating elaborate fictions to explain away what his rotting legs had stolen from him. The extraordinary measures taken to mask Henry's condition revealed just how desperate the situation had become. The king's wardrobe accounts show massive expenditures on stockings, not for fashion but for function. These weren't ordinary silk stockings, but specialized garments designed to be absorbent and concealing. Multiple pairs had to be destroyed daily because the discharge from his wounds would seep through and stain them beyond recovery. The royal household employed dedicated staff whose sole responsibility was managing the king's leg dressings and ensuring he always appeared as pristine as possible in public. These unfortunate servants worked in shifts, dealing with the most intimate and grotesque aspects of Henry's decay. They would unwrap layers of soiled bandages, clean wounds that reeked of infection, pack them with fresh cloth soaked in various medicinal preparations that did nothing to cure the underlying problem, and then wrap everything up again in an elaborate procedure that took hours. The used bandages had to be disposed of carefully, burned immediately to prevent the spread of infection and to eliminate the evidence of just how bad things really were. Imagine the psychological toll on these servants, forced to maintain absolute discretion about what they witnessed, knowing that speaking openly about the king's condition could cost them their lives. The palace implemented actual architectural and procedural changes to accommodate Henry's deteriorating state. Rooms where the king spent extended time received enhanced ventilation systems, essentially large openings covered with decorative screens that allowed air to circulate more freely. Enormous quantities of aromatic herbs were purchased and burned constantly: rosemary, lavender, sage, and more exotic imports like frankincense. The household accounts show staggering sums spent on perfumes and scented oils, expensive substances that would be used to anoint curtains, furnishings, and even walls in an attempt to create a barrier against the smell of decay. Special protocols were developed for court appearances. Staff would prepare rooms hours in advance, filling them with pleasant scents and ensuring maximum airflow. The king would be dressed in his most elaborate garments, layers of perfumed fabric designed to act as a buffer between his infected body and the outside world. Attendants carrying censers of burning incense would precede and follow him, creating a mobile cloud of aromatic smoke. Despite all these measures, contemporary accounts make it clear that success was limited at best. The infection was too pervasive, the smell too powerful to be completely concealed, no matter how much money and effort was thrown at the problem. The psychological impact of these concealment efforts extended beyond just the king himself. The entire court existed in a state of collective denial, participating in an elaborate charade where everyone pretended not to notice the obvious. This created a bizarre atmosphere where reality and fiction blurred together. Courtiers would stand in rooms thick with the smell of rotting flesh and incense, discussing matters of state as if nothing unusual surrounded them. Foreign visitors, not yet indoctrinated into this culture of denial, would struggle to maintain their composure, their expressions betraying shock that the English court seemed determined to ignore. Young nobles new to court would learn quickly that survival meant mastering the art of showing no reaction whatsoever to the king's condition. The older, more experienced courtiers had perfected a kind of selective blindness, training themselves to simply not register what their senses were telling them. This mass delusion became part of the fabric of Tudor court life, a shared understanding that certain truths were too dangerous to acknowledge even through facial expressions or body language. But there was one place where no amount of perfume, incense, or collective denial could hide the devastating reality of Henry's decay. And that was the royal bedchamber, where marriages were supposed to be consummated and heirs conceived. The wedding night between Henry and Anne of Cleves has been distorted by centuries of propaganda, but the physical reality was far more horrific than the sanitized versions history recorded. Picture the scene honestly for once. A woman who had traveled hundreds of miles to marry a king she'd never met, prepared for her wedding night with all the anxiety any bride might feel. She enters the royal bedchamber, elaborately decorated with the finest silks and tapestries, candles providing romantic lighting, everything arranged to suggest luxury and passion. And then Henry arrives. Not the vigorous young man from paintings that were decades old, but a bloated giant whose body had betrayed him utterly. The smell hit Anne before the king even fully entered the room. Despite the perfumes he wore, despite the elaborate preparations of his attendants, there was no concealing the stench of infection at close quarters. As Henry approached the bed, removing his outer garments, the situation became undeniable. His legs, wrapped in bandages that were already showing signs of seepage despite being freshly changed, carried with them the unmistakable odor of rotting tissue. The silk sheets that were supposed to witness royal passion would instead become soaked with discharge from wounds that never healed. Anne, raised in a disciplined German court, maintained her composure through this nightmare. But the revulsion must have been overwhelming. What happened in that bedchamber exposes the cruelest irony of Henry's treatment of Anne. The king, whose own body reeked of decay, would later claim that Anne had an unpleasant odor that repulsed him. This projection of his own condition onto his innocent wife reveals the depths of his psychological damage and self-delusion. Henry's leg ulcers would have made any physical intimacy not just unpleasant, but genuinely painful for him. The pressure of movement, the physical exertion required, all of it would have sent waves of agony through his infected legs. Add to this the hormonal disruptions caused by chronic infection, the effects of heavy opiate use, and the psychological burden of constant pain, and you have a man physically incapable of performing his royal duty. But Henry's monumental pride could never admit to such weakness. Instead, he constructed an elaborate fiction where the failure belonged to Anne. He told his physicians and confidants that she was unattractive, that her body was somehow defective, that she smelled unpleasant, projecting onto her the very qualities that his own rotting flesh possessed. The courtiers, desperate to maintain royal favor, eagerly participated in this delusion, inventing cruel nicknames and spreading rumors that blamed Anne for what was entirely Henry's physical inadequacy. The nickname Flanders Mare has echoed through history as evidence of Anne's supposed ugliness, but the truth is far more sinister. This insult was deliberate projection, a way for Henry and his sycophantic court to redirect attention away from the king's decay onto an innocent woman. The mere reference suggested animalistic qualities, someone coarse and unappealing, but who was really behaving like an animal? The king who could no longer control his own bodily functions, whose wounds leaked constantly like a broken vessel, whose infected flesh stank like a dead beast left in the sun? Anne arrived in England clean, healthy, and dignified. Henry welcomed her with legs that oozed pus and blood, wounds that smelled of death, and a body that was literally decomposing while he still lived. Yet somehow the propaganda machine of Tudor England managed to twist this reality completely around, making Anne the subject of mockery while Henry remained above reproach. This reversal tells us everything about how power operates, how those in authority can force entire courts to deny obvious truth and accept manufactured lies. The real stench in that bedchamber came from Henry's ulcerated legs, from infection eating away at his bones, from the decay that no amount of perfume could mask once the doors were closed and the facades dropped. Surviving at Henry's court required developing specific skills that had nothing to do with politics or intrigue and everything to do with physical endurance. Courtiers who wanted to maintain favor needed to position themselves near the king regularly, demonstrating loyalty and availability for service. But proximity to Henry meant proximity to that smell. Hours spent in enclosed spaces where the stench of infection hung heavy in the air despite all attempts to mask it. Those who succeeded developed techniques that were taught informally among the court's inner circles. The most basic was controlled breathing, shallow breaths through the mouth rather than deep inhalations through the nose. Experienced courtiers learned to time their breathing, taking fuller breaths only when the king's attention was directed elsewhere or when they could briefly turn away. Some kept small sachets of herbs tucked in their clothing, occasionally raising a hand to their face in what looked like a casual gesture, but was actually bringing the sachet close enough to their nose to provide a moment of olfactory relief. The women of the court carried fans not just for cooling, but as tools to discreetly direct airflow away from themselves when near the king. The physical toll of serving close to Henry extended beyond just enduring unpleasant smells. Several accounts mention ladies-in-waiting and younger courtiers actually fainting during extended periods in the king's presence, though these incidents were always attributed to other causes like tight corsets, warm rooms, or sudden illness. The truth was that prolonged exposure to the smell of decay, combined with the stress of maintaining perfect composure, sometimes overwhelmed people's systems. The nausea was real, the headaches were genuine, and the psychological strain of pretending normalcy in such abnormal circumstances affected everyone differently. Those who showed weakness were quietly reassigned to positions that kept them away from the king, creating a kind of natural selection where only the strongest stomachs and most controlled reactions survived in the inner circle. Paradoxically, this meant that the people closest to Henry, those with the most influence over policy and decisions, were often chosen not for their wisdom or political acumen, but for their ability to physically tolerate being near a rotting human being. Imagine the implications of that: a kingdom's direction influenced by who could best endure, standing next to their decomposing monarch. The unspoken rules governing behavior around the king's condition were enforced with ruthless efficiency. Any visible reaction to the smell, a wrinkled nose, a turned head, a grimace, could be interpreted as disrespect or worse, as evidence of disloyalty. Courtiers who failed to control their reactions found themselves excluded from future royal events. Their prospects at court effectively ended by a momentary lapse in composure. More serious offenses, like openly commenting on the smell or the king's condition, could lead to accusations of spreading malicious rumors or even treason. The court had effectively weaponized silence, creating an environment where truth itself became dangerous. This atmosphere of enforced denial had profound effects on how business was conducted. Important discussions of policy, military strategy, and diplomatic relations took place in rooms where everyone was concentrating on not reacting to the overwhelming smell of infection. How many crucial decisions were made by people who were partially distracted by the need to control their physical responses? How much energy that should have gone into governance instead went into maintaining this elaborate facade? The decay of Henry's body was literally rotting the functionality of his government from within, but acknowledging that reality was impossible within the twisted logic of Tudor court life. The royal physicians occupied perhaps the most morally compromised position in the entire palace. These were educated men, trained in the best medical knowledge available in the 16th century, who understood perfectly well what was happening to their king. They could see the infection spreading, smell the characteristic odor of necrotic tissue, recognize the symptoms of systemic illness affecting Henry's entire body. They knew that his sexual dysfunction, his mood swings, his increasing irrationality, all stemmed at least partly from his medical condition and the opiate treatments they themselves prescribed. Yet they were caught in an impossible bind. Their duty was to heal the king, but healing required honestly diagnosing and treating the condition. Honestly diagnosing meant acknowledging that Henry's body was failing, that he was not the virile monarch he pretended to be, that his marriage failures had a medical rather than personal cause. And acknowledging any of that could cost them their positions, their reputations, or potentially their lives. So they chose survival over truth, professional compromise over medical integrity, and in doing so became accomplices in one of history's most elaborate medical cover-ups. The creative fiction these physicians generated to explain Henry's condition reveals the extent of their desperation and moral flexibility. They couldn't deny that the king had leg ulcers; those were visible and undeniable. But they could and did craft explanations that shifted blame away from any inherent weakness in Henry himself. They theorized about bad humors that needed to be expelled through the wounds, suggesting that the ulcers were actually beneficial, allowing toxic substances to escape the body. This was medical nonsense, but it served a purpose by framing Henry's grotesque condition as a kind of therapeutic drainage rather than a sign of decay. When Anne of Cleves entered the picture, the physicians saw an opportunity to externalize blame even further. They began suggesting that foreign influences might have disrupted the king's natural balance. German air, different diets, even the stress of dealing with foreign customs, all were proposed as factors affecting Henry's health and vitality. Most perversely, they began to hint that Anne herself might be somehow responsible for the king's inability to consummate the marriage. Perhaps her German blood carried humors that were incompatible with English physiology. Perhaps her unfamiliarity with English ways created an atmosphere that disturbed the king's natural functions. These suggestions were medically absurd, but they provided Henry with the external scapegoat he desperately needed. The documentation these physicians produced became part of the official record. Medical reports that supported the king's version of events, while carefully avoiding truths that might undermine royal authority. They described examinations of Anne's body, searching for defects that might explain Henry's lack of interest, but somehow never mentioned the obvious fact that Henry's rotting legs made physical intimacy agonizing for him. They recorded the king's complaints about his wife's supposed inadequacies while remaining silent about his own obvious deterioration. These reports would be used to justify the annulment, presented as objective medical evidence when they were actually carefully constructed political documents designed to support a predetermined conclusion. Future historians would read these records and accept them as factual accounts, perpetuating the lie that Anne of Cleves was somehow deficient when the real problem was always Henry's decaying body. The physicians knew they were participating in this deception, but they also knew that speaking truth to power in Tudor England was a quick path to the scaffold. Their choice to prioritize their own survival over medical accuracy is understandable on a human level, but it had consequences that extended far beyond just ruining Anne's reputation. It established a precedent where medical science could be bent to serve political purposes, where the truth of the body could be overridden by the needs of the state. The international diplomatic implications of Henry's decay created a unique challenge for England's foreign policy. Ambassadors from Spain, France, the Holy Roman Empire, and various Italian states all had to conduct regular audiences with the English king, meetings that were essential for maintaining diplomatic relations and negotiating treaties. These ambassadors were trained observers, educated men whose job included reporting detailed accounts of foreign courts back to their own governments. They could hardly avoid noticing the overwhelming smell that accompanied Henry, especially during longer meetings in enclosed spaces. Their dispatches home provide some of the most honest contemporary accounts of the king's condition, precisely because they weren't subject to the same pressure to maintain illusions that English courtiers faced. Spanish ambassadors wrote with barely concealed disgust about audiences, where the smell of the king's infections was so overpowering that they struggled to concentrate on the diplomatic business at hand. French envoys reported in coded language about the English king's indisposition that was evident to anyone who came near him. Representatives from the Italian city-states, more accustomed to frank discussion of physical matters, were occasionally more direct in their assessments, describing Henry's condition in medical terms that made clear just how serious his deterioration had become. These reports circulated among European courts, becoming part of the shared knowledge that informed how other nations viewed England and its king. The practical impact was significant. Negotiations that should have been straightforward became complicated by the physical challenge of spending extended time in Henry's presence. Some ambassadors requested that meetings be conducted in larger, better ventilated spaces, using various diplomatic excuses that everyone understood were really about avoiding prolonged exposure to the smell. Others asked for shorter audiences more frequently rather than long single meetings, another tactful way of limiting exposure while maintaining the appearance of normal diplomatic relations. The cumulative effect was to make England seem weak, led by a king whose body was visibly failing even as he projected power and authority. This perception affected everything from trade negotiations to military alliances to decisions about whether to risk conflict with England. Foreign powers began to calculate that Henry's declining health made England vulnerable, a kingdom that might soon face succession crisis or internal instability. The smell wafting from the king's infected legs was literally weakening England's diplomatic position, making the nation seem less formidable than its military strength and economic resources suggested it should be. The propaganda value of Henry's condition was not lost on his enemies, particularly in Catholic Europe where resentment over England's break with Rome still ran deep. The Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope used accounts of Henry's physical decay as moral evidence of God's judgment against a heretic king. Religious pamphlets circulated describing Henry's rotting legs as divine punishment for his rejection of papal authority and his persecution of Catholic faithful in England. The more graphic details of his condition, the smell, the constant drainage, the pain, all were presented as signs that God himself had cursed this rebellious monarch. While this was obvious propaganda, it resonated with audiences who wanted to believe that Henry's suffering was cosmic justice for his crimes against the true church. Even in Protestant regions, the accounts of the English king's decay raised uncomfortable questions. If God truly favored the Reformation, why was one of its most powerful royal supporters literally decomposing? The fact that these discussions even happened shows how thoroughly Henry's physical condition had become a matter of international political significance, his rotting legs a topic of debate in courts and theological discussions across the continent. By the final years of his life, Henry VIII had become a grotesque mockery of the king he once was. The transformation was so complete that those who remembered his youth struggled to reconcile their memories with the reality before them. The athletic giant who had once been able to ride for hours, who had excelled at jousting and hunting, who had danced with energy and grace, was gone. In his place was a man so massive that movement required mechanical assistance, his body bloated from inactivity and edema related to his chronic infections. His legs, the source of so much agony and stench for so many years, had deteriorated beyond what anyone thought possible while the patient remained alive. The ulcers never healed, they only grew, multiplying and deepening until both legs were more wound than healthy tissue. The smell had intensified to the point where even the most elaborate masking efforts failed completely. Courtiers who had once managed to tolerate proximity now found it genuinely unbearable. Some sources suggest that by 1546, the stench surrounding Henry was noticeable from several feet away, even through multiple layers of perfumed clothing and constant incense burning. The king's final months paint a picture of suffering that is difficult to fully comprehend. Every movement caused pain, not just from his legs, but from the various other ailments that had accumulated as his overall health collapsed. He could barely walk, requiring servants and mechanical devices to move him from place to place. His sleep was disrupted by constant pain despite ever-increasing doses of opium. His appetite, once legendary, had diminished as the infection caused systemic effects that impacted his entire body. The psychological toll must have been immense, watching his own body betray him piece by piece, knowing that he who had once held absolute power over life and death in England could not command his own flesh to heal or even to stop rotting. When he finally died in January 1547, those present reported that the end came with a strange mixture of relief and horror. Relief that this suffering, both for Henry and for those forced to witness it, was finally over. Horror at seeing what had become of a man who had once been England's golden prince. The disposal of his body presented unique challenges. Even in death, the smell of decay was overwhelming, the infection having consumed so much of his flesh that decomposition was already well advanced before his heart stopped beating. The final indignity came during the transport of Henry's body to Windsor for burial. According to contemporary accounts, though some historians debate their reliability, the king's coffin burst open during the journey. The gases of decomposition, combined with the already necrotic state of his tissues, created pressure that the coffin could not contain. The symbolism is almost too perfect to be real, and yet multiple sources mention it. The king who had wielded absolute power, who had changed England's religion to suit his personal desires, who had sent wives and counselors to their deaths on his whim, ended as a bloated corpse that literally exploded from its own internal rot. Meanwhile, Anne of Cleves, the woman he had blamed for his own inadequacy, lived peacefully through the reigns of Edward, Mary, and into Elizabeth's early years. She died in 1557, having spent nearly 2 decades enjoying independence, respect, and comfort. While Henry's body rotted at Windsor, his reputation already beginning the slow process of historical revision that would try to paint him as a great king despite his obvious moral corruption, Anne's legacy was one of dignity, intelligence, and survival. The smell that had filled Hampton Court, that had driven courtiers to devise breathing techniques, and ambassadors to request shorter audiences that had destroyed marriages and distorted politics was finally gone. If you've made it this far, you've learned the truth that Tudor propaganda tried to bury for centuries. The real story wasn't about ugly foreign queens or royal disappointment. It was about a king whose rotting body mirrored his corrupted soul, and a woman who survived by refusing to believe his lies about her. Subscribe if you want more dark historical truths that challenge what you thought you knew. Comment with other historical lies you want exposed. And hit that like button if you agree that Anne of Cleves deserves to be remembered as a survivor, not a failure. Because when you know the truth about what really stank in that palace, you realize everything you were taught about this period needs to be reconsidered.